June 1972, a small room in New Jersey. No cameras, no flowers, no reporters waiting outside. Just a man, 39 years old, lying still. The world didn't stop. The radio kept playing. People kept driving to work, eating breakfast, going about their Tuesday like nothing had changed, because for most of them, nothing had. His name wasn't on the evening news. There was no industry statement, no tribute concert announced for the following week. The musicians who built careers on the sound he pioneered didn't pause to say his name. He was just gone. And the silence around his death was so complete, so undisturbed, that it almost felt intentional. Now let me ask you something. Think about the last time a song stopped you cold, a voice that came through your speakers and made your chest tighten, a falsetto that cracked at exactly the right moment, carrying something that felt less like a performance and more like a confession. Maybe it was a Marvin Gaye record. Maybe it was Sam Cooke. Maybe it was something more recent, a modern R&B singer who learned to let emotion bleed through technical perfection. Whoever it was, do you know where that sound came from? Not the singer, not the producer, not the label. I mean the root of it. The person who first figured out that a voice could move between power and vulnerability in the same breath. The person who proved that gospel fire and secular soul weren't opposites. They were the same flame burning in two different rooms. Do you know that name? His name was Clyde McPhatter. And there's a reasonable chance you've never heard it. Here's what makes that remarkable. Sam Cooke didn't just admire him, he studied him. Marvin Gaye traced his own vocal approach back to what Clyde had already done. Smokey Robinson, Jackie Wilson, Al Green, the lineage runs straight through this one man's voice like a river, through every city you've ever loved. Elvis Presley, the man history crowned the king of rock and roll, once called Clyde McPhatter the best singer in the world. Not one of the best. And yet, when Clyde died in that quiet room in New Jersey, at 39 years old, with his health broken and his money gone and his phone no longer ringing, not one of those names made the front page, not one stadium filled with mourning fans, not one headline declaring that American music had just lost its architect. The man whose voice helped build the house that soul, doo-wop, and R&B were born in, died outside the gates, unannounced, unacknowledged, alone. So we have to ask two questions. The first, how does that happen? How does the person who taught a generation of legends how to sing end up forgotten before he's even buried? And the second question, the one that should make you uncomfortable, who are we forgetting right now? Stay with us. Because this isn't just history, this is a mirror. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to where it began. Not the Apollo Theater, not the recording studios of Harlem, not the screaming crowds or the Billboard charts. Go back further. Go back to Durham, North Carolina, 1932. Clyde Leslie McPhatter was born on November 15th of that year, the fourth of 6 children. His father, George, was a Baptist minister. His mother, Beulah, was the kind of woman whose faith didn't waver. Not under poverty, not under pressure, not under the weight of a country that had made very clear it did not consider her family fully human. This was the American South under Jim Crow. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. You could be talented, you could be brilliant, you could be the most gifted person in your county, your city, your state. And the system would still find a way to make sure that talent stayed small, that it stayed contained, that it never threatened the order of things. Black families in the segregated South didn't have generational wealth to pass down. They didn't have access to the same schools, the same stages, the same rooms where decisions got made. What they had, what no one could legally take from them, was the church. And inside the church, they had music. For the McPhatter family, music wasn't entertainment. It wasn't a hobby or a side interest. It was the architecture of daily life. It was how they processed grief and expressed gratitude and held themselves together when the world outside gave them every reason to fall apart. And young Clyde, from the time he could stand at the front of a congregation, had a voice that made people go still. Not politely still, not the kind of quiet that's just good manners in church, genuinely still, the kind of stillness that happens when something moves through a room that's bigger than the person making the sound. People who heard him as a child would describe it the same way, almost word for word. That boy has something in him that didn't come from here. He was 10 years old when everything shifted again. Like thousands of black families before them, the McPhatters joined the Great Migration, that long, desperate, hopeful movement of people heading north in search of something better, something less suffocating. They landed in Harlem, New York. And for a boy who had only known the tight rhythms of a Southern church, Harlem was like stepping into a different frequency entirely. Jazz bleeding out of second-floor windows, blues crackling from corner radios, gospel pouring from storefront churches wedged between barbershops and bodegas. And something new, something that didn't have a clean name yet, rising up from street corners where young men gathered in the evening and stacked their voices like bricks, building harmonies out of nothing but instinct and desire. Clyde absorbed all of it. He joined a Harlem gospel quartet called the Mount Lebanon Singers, still a teenager, still carrying the church in his bones. But already you could hear something in his voice that the church alone couldn't fully explain, something that wanted more room than a Sunday morning could give it. And that's where the tension began. Because in the black church community of that era, stepping into secular music wasn't a career decision. It was a moral one. It meant leaving the sacred for the sinful, trading hymns for nightclubs, turning your God-given gift toward money and fame instead of worship and service. People didn't just disapprove. They grieved. They prayed for you. Some of them never forgave you. Clyde felt all of that. His father was a minister. The church wasn't just his community. It was his identity, his foundation, the place where his voice had first been recognized as something extraordinary. Walking away from it meant walking away from the only stage that had ever told him he mattered. But the pull was undeniable. There's a particular kind of longing that doesn't give you a choice. It doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't wait for the right moment. It simply insists, quietly at first, then louder, then so loud that staying still becomes its own kind of betrayal. Clyde heard that voice, not from God this time, but from somewhere just as deep, a voice that said, "Your gift is too large for one room. You already know this. Stop pretending you don't." By 1950, at 18 years old, he stopped pretending. He walked into an audition for Billy Ward and his Dominoes, a polished, ambitious R&B group with national reach and serious momentum. He had no connections, no industry contacts, no backup plan. He had one thing, and the moment he opened his mouth, Billy Ward, a classically trained musician who had heard thousands of voices, went quiet. "The best voice I'd ever heard on a young man," Ward would later say. Just like that, the boy from Durham's church pews became the lead tenor of one of the hottest acts in America. The church had given him a foundation. Harlem had given him a hunger. And now, the music industry was about to give him something else entirely, not what he deserved, what it decided he was worth. Let's talk about what success actually looked like for Clyde McPhatter. Because from the outside, and the industry made sure you only ever saw the outside, it looked extraordinary. The Dominoes hit the national stage like a detonation. Their 1951 recording of 60-Minute Man didn't just chart. It rewrote what was possible. Unapologetically bold, rhythmically relentless, dripping with an energy that radio programmers weren't sure they were allowed to play and couldn't stop playing anyway. It sat at #1 on the Billboard R&B chart for 14 weeks. In 1951. When the music industry was still largely segregated, when black artists were routinely denied airplay on mainstream stations, when breaking through to white audiences was considered nearly impossible. This song did it anyway. And at the center of it all was Clyde's voice. That soaring, keying, gospel-drenched tenor that made grown men lean forward in their seats and made women in the front row forget where they were. Critics scrambled for language to describe it. Audiences didn't need language, they just screamed. The Dominoes were selling out venues, the records were flying off shelves. Billy Ward was being written about as a visionary, a genius, the architect of a new American sound. Now let me tell you what Clyde was being paid. $10 a week, not per show, not per record sold, per week. While 60-Minute Man was climbing charts, generating revenue, opening doors that had never been opened before in American popular music, the man whose voice made all of that possible was clearing $10 a week. And to put that in perspective, a modest meal at a New York diner in 1951 cost about $1.50. $10 didn't cover a week of eating decently, let alone rent, transportation, or anything resembling the lifestyle the industry was selling to fans who idolized these performers. Hold that image in your mind for a moment. Two realities, same moment, same song. On stage, the crowd is screaming Clyde's name. Women are fainting in the aisles. This wasn't hyperbole. This was documented. Reporters are scribbling superlatives. Billy Ward is shaking hands with promoters and talking about the next tour. Offstage, Clyde McPhatter cannot afford a decent meal. This is not a metaphor. This is not dramatization for effect. This is the contract. Billy Ward ran the dominoes like a corporation with one asset and one beneficiary. The asset was Clyde's voice. The beneficiary was Billy Ward. The musicians worked grueling schedules, rehearsals, travel, back-to-back performances under strict rules, with fines for lateness and penalties for mistakes. The revenue flowed upward. The credit flowed upward. And the men who actually created the sound, they received what the man at the top decided they deserved. $10 a week. By 1953, Clyde had had enough. He left the dominoes. And almost immediately, a man named Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic Records came calling. Ertegun was sharp. He understood something that most of the industry was still catching up to, that rhythm and blues wasn't a niche market. It was the future of American popular music. And Clyde McPhatter was the clearest proof of that he'd ever heard. So Atlantic signed him. And they put him at the center of a new group, the Drifters. What followed was a creative eruption. Money Honey, such a night. Honey Love. Record after record that didn't just sell, they defined a sound. The seamless blend of gospel intensity and street corner harmony that would become the DNA of doo-wop, soul, and eventually every R&B act that Motown would polish into global stardom a decade later. Clyde wasn't just performing these songs, he was constructing something. A new emotional language for American music. A way of using the human voice that nobody had quite systematized before, the call and response between lead and backing vocals, the falsetto that didn't decorate a melody but carried its entire emotional weight, the phrasing borrowed from Sunday morning sermons and placed inside Saturday Night Desire. The record sold. The crowds came. The name Clyde McPhatter meant something. Now let me ask you a question I don't need you to answer out loud. Have you ever wondered why the people who own songs are almost never the people who created them? Have you ever looked at the fine print of a 1950 recording contract and asked who actually benefited when a record went gold? Because here's what those contracts looked like for black artists at Atlantic, and labels like it in that era. The label owned the masters. The label controlled distribution. The label decided what got promoted and what got shelved. And the royalty rates, when they existed at all, were structured in ways that ensured the artist saw fractions of what the music actually generated. Atlantic recognized Clyde's genius. They also recognized exactly how to monetize it while keeping him dependent, underpaid, and replaceable. And the moment he became too expensive to maintain, too aware of his own value, too likely to ask for what he was actually worth, they replaced him. Just like that. New lead singer, new contracts. Same group name because Atlantic owned that too. Picture it. Clyde McPhatter walks away from Atlantic Records with no contract, no royalties, no ownership stake in the recordings that bore his voice, no financial security, and no legal recourse. Somewhere across the city, a radio is playing Money Honey. His voice, his phrasing, his falsetto on the bridge that made the engineer stop and ask them to run it back during the original session, playing on someone else's dime. In a building he no longer had the right to enter, the industry had taken everything it needed from Clyde McPhatter, and it had given him just enough, just barely enough, to keep him believing the next opportunity was around the corner. That belief, as it turned out, was the most expensive thing he ever owned. Let's stop calling this a tragedy. Tragedies are accidents. Tragedies are the result of bad luck, bad timing, forces beyond anyone's control. What happened to Clyde McPhatter was not a tragedy. It was a system working exactly as designed. Here is the reframe I need you to sit with. Clyde McPhatter was not forgotten because the world didn't know him. Millions of people knew him. His record sold. His name was on marquees. His voice was on the radio in living rooms across America. He was known. He was forgotten because the music industry of the 1950s was built structurally, legally, deliberately built on a single operating principle: extract the value, keep the creator dependent, move on when they're no longer useful. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't even hidden. It was just the way things worked. And for black artists especially, it worked with a particular efficiency, because they had fewer legal protections, fewer industry connections, fewer options to walk away, and almost no recourse when the contracts they signed turned out to be engineered against them. Let's be specific, because vague outrage is easy to dismiss. In the 1950s, a standard recording contract gave the label ownership of the master recordings permanently. Not for a term, not until the artist recouped, permanently. The voice on the record, the performance, the creative interpretation that made the song worth recording in the first place, legally. None of that belonged to the person who created it. Royalty structures, when they existed at all, were calculated after the label deducted pressing costs, distribution fees, promotional expenses, and a dozen other line items that conveniently ensured most artists never saw a meaningful check. And when a performer was dropped, reassigned, or simply replaced, there was no severance, no pension, no health care, no ownership stake in the catalog they had spent years building. You walked in with your voice. You walked out with nothing else. Now understand this. Clyde McPhatter was not an isolated case. He was not an unlucky exception to an otherwise fair system. He was the rule. Little Willie John, Hank Ballard, Wynonie Harris, Ivory Joe Hunter. Name after name, black pioneers who defined the sound of mid-century American music, who ended their lives in poverty, obscurity, or both, while the industry that consumed their genius moved on without a backward glance. What made Clyde's story the starkest example wasn't that his mistreatment was uniquely cruel. It was that his influence was uniquely enormous, and the contrast between what he gave and what he received was therefore impossible to look away from. He didn't just contribute to a genre, he built the foundation that everyone else stood on. And the foundation, as it turned out, doesn't get a plaque. So let's talk about what Clyde McPhatter actually did. Not in broad strokes, not in the comfortable language of he was influential or he pioneered a sound. That kind of praise is easy to give and easy to forget. Let's talk about the specific things he invented, the technical innovations that his own name was never attached to, but that you have been listening to in one form or another every single day of your life. The first thing, the falsetto as emotional language. Before Clyde, the falsetto was a display. It was a moment of vocal acrobatics, a way for a singer to show range, to dazzle a crowd, to hit a note that made the audience gasp. Clyde did something different with it. He made it break, not carelessly, not as a mistake. Deliberately, with surgical precision, he would let his voice crack at the exact moment a lyric needed to feel like it was costing him something, like the emotion was too large to be contained inside perfect technique. That crack, that controlled fracture in an otherwise flawless vocal performance, that is the sound of vulnerability weaponized. Every time you've heard a singer let their voice splinter on a held note, Smokey Robinson, Al Green, Luther Vandross, and decades later, artists like Frank Ocean or Usher at his most unguarded, you're hearing the direct descendants of a technique that Clyde McPhatter developed in church pews and recording studios before most of those men were born. He didn't just hit the high notes, he taught the world how to mean them. The second thing, gospel phrasing inside secular music. This sounds simple. It was not simple. The black church had its own musical grammar, a way of bending syllables, stretching consonants, inserting micropauses that felt like breath and prayer simultaneously, a way of making a single word carry the weight of an entire experience, the way a preacher would take the word mercy and turn it into a 3-second journey. That grammar belonged to Sunday morning. Clyde picked it up, carried it out of the church, and placed it inside Saturday night. Not as imitation, not as novelty, as genuine emotional truth. When he sang Have Mercy Baby in 1952, he wasn't performing gospel. He was using gospel's architecture, its rhythms, its plea structures, its call to something larger than the individual, to make a secular song feel sacred. That fusion, that refusal to treat the church and the street as separate emotional worlds became the definition of soul music. It became the DNA of Motown. It became the template that Berry Gordy would build an empire on a decade later. Clyde built the template. Gordy built the empire. Guess which name is in the history books? Listen to any Drifters recording from Clyde's era. Don't listen to him. Listen to Around Him. Notice how the backing vocals don't simply support the melody. They respond to it. They lean in when he leans back. They pull away when he pushes forward. The whole arrangement breathes like a single living thing, with Clyde's lead as the lungs and the harmonies as the heartbeat. That was not accidental. That was Clyde's instinct for group architecture. An understanding that a lead singer and a backing group weren't two separate elements to be mixed together in post-production, but one integrated instrument that had to be played in real time. That call and response dynamic, the feeling that the voices in a song are talking to each other, became the structural backbone of doo-wop, of early soul, of the entire Motown sound that would define American pop music through the 1960s. It is everywhere. It is invisible, because Clyde's name was never put on it. And here is where it becomes almost unbearable. Elvis Presley, a man who would go on to become one of the most celebrated musicians in American history, did not casually acknowledge Clyde. He didn't mention him politely in one interview and move on. Elvis called Clyde McPhatter the best singer in the world, not one of, not among the greats, the best. The man history crowned as the king of rock and roll, a genre that was itself built on the foundation of Black American music, pointed directly at Clyde McPhatter and said, "That is the standard." And still. 15 years after Clyde died, broken alone in New Jersey. 15 years, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame got around to inducting him as a solo artist. He had already been inducted once as a member of the Drifters. That made him the first artist in Hall of Fame history to be enshrined twice. The institution was so struck by this anomaly that they created a name for it. They called it the Clyde McPhatter Club. They used his name to honor the achievement of being recognized more than once by an industry that had refused to recognize him at all while he was alive. They named a club after him. They just didn't give him the club. But here's what the industry couldn't do. It could take his contracts. It could take his royalties. It could take his health, his momentum, his prime years, his financial security, and ultimately his name from the marquee. It could not take what his voice had already set in motion, because sound doesn't ask permission to travel. In the years after Clyde's death, something slow and quiet began to happen, not in boardrooms or on charts, in the places where music is actually understood. University archives, late-night radio programs, the dog-eared notebooks of obsessive record collectors who had been saying for years that something wasn't adding up. Musicologists started pulling at threads when they traced the falsetto technique that defined Smokey Robinson's early work. The thread led back to Clyde. When they mapped the gospel phrasing that gave Sam Cooke's voice its particular ache, the thread led back to Clyde. When they reconstructed the call and response architecture that made Motown records feel like conversations instead of performances, the thread led back again and again to the same man. The further back they looked, the more clearly he appeared. Not as a footnote, as a foundation. And slowly, imperfectly, belatedly, in the way that history tends to correct itself when the correction is long overdue. The acknowledgement began to come. His recordings were remastered, documentaries were made, music journalists who had spent careers writing about soul and R&B began including his name in the sentences where it had always belonged. The Hall of Fame, for whatever that institution is worth, at least got there eventually. And in music schools today, when professors teach the architecture of American popular music, when they explain how gospel became R&B became soul, became the emotional vocabulary of every pop record made in the last 60 years, Clyde McPhatter's name is in that lesson. Not loudly enough, not yet, but it's there. Here is what I want you to hold on to. Clyde McPhatter did not leave behind a mansion. He did not leave behind a fortune or a catalog he owned or a business empire built on his legacy. He left behind a language, a way of using the human voice that had never existed in quite that form before he invented it, a way of letting emotion and technique exist simultaneously, not in tension but in conversation. A way of singing that said, "I'm not performing for you. I'm telling you the truth." And the truth sounds like this. That language is alive. Every time a modern R&B singer lets their voice fracture on a note that hurts too much to hold perfectly, that's Clyde. Every time a harmony stack breathes and responds like a living thing beneath a lead vocal, that's Clyde. Every time a falsetto carries something that feels less like a high note and more like a human being refusing to stop feeling, that's Clyde. He didn't leave his name on any of it, but he left his sound on all of it. And the sound, unlike the contracts, unlike the royalties, unlike the industry that consumed him and discarded him, the sound has never stopped playing. You've just heard Clyde McPhatter's story, and I need you to resist the urge to file it away as history. Because that's the comfortable thing to do with a story like this. Label it, date it, place it safely in the past where it can be respected from a distance without requiring anything from you. Terrible what they did to him back then. Things are different now. Are they? Think about the music you consume this week, not the artists you love. I'm not asking you to defend them. I'm asking about the ecosystem around them. Do you know who wrote the songs you've been streaming? Not the performer, the writer, the producer who built the track at 2 a.m. in a studio they were renting on credit, the session vocalist whose voice is on the hook of a song that has 40 million plays and who received a flat fee, signed away their rights, and will never see another dollar from those 40 million streams. Do you know how much a stream pays an independent artist? Less than half a cent, 40 million streams. The kind of number that feels like success, like arrival, like proof that your work matters. Around $15,000 before the label takes its cut. The numbers have changed since Clyde's time. The exploitation hasn't. Now I'm not asking you to fix an industry tonight. I'm asking you to do something smaller and in some ways harder. I'm asking you to pay attention. When you hear a voice that moves you, ask where it came from. Follow the lineage. Tells you Elvis invented rock and roll. Tells you Elvis invented rock and roll. Ask them what Elvis was listening to when he was 18 years old. Ask them whose records he wore out. Ask them who taught him how to mean it. Say those names out loud. Because here's the thing about erasure. It doesn't require malice to continue. It only requires silence. It only requires the rest of us to keep consuming without asking questions. And every time we do that, we make the same choice the industry made. We decide, without deciding, that some voices matter more than others. Clyde McPhatter died at 39 years old. No headlines, no tributes, no one has seen a stop playing the music, but his voice is still here. It's in every song you've ever loved that made your chest tighten without knowing why. It's in the architecture of sounds you've heard so many times they feel like home. He built that home. He just never got to live in it. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Not about Clyde, about right now. Who are we doing this to today? Which voice are we consuming without crediting? Which name are we letting slip into obscurity while the sound it created plays on forever? Which 39-year-old is sitting somewhere right now, having given everything to the music, while the industry decides what they're worth? Clyde McPhatter couldn't be saved, but the next one can. Say his name, share his story, and then go looking for the ones who haven't been forgotten yet, because remembering the dead is an act of grief. Recognizing the living is an act of justice. His name was Clyde McPhatter, and now you know.